Good morning, everybody. This is Colin Talbot with another video for our Public Administration Exchange series. This one's slightly different in that we're looking at something which is obviously related to public administration, a great issue of concern to public administration, public managers worldwide at the moment because of the pandemic. But starts from a story in the UK about the terrible fire that took place at Grenfell Tower 4 years ago. And I was very interested to read a book by Gill Kernick, who joins me this morning. This is her new book. And she's going to talk us through the book itself, and she'll explain why she's got a particular connection to what happened at Grenfell. But her book explores much wider issues about how we ought to be able to prepare for and deal with catastrophes. So welcome, Gill.
Thanks,
good to see you. And I'll hand over to you, and you can say more about the background to this and your connection to it.
Perfect, and I will share my screen. So that's the title of the book, but let me go through, if I can make the slides move. There we go, what I'm going to talk about. So firstly is the context, motivation and intention of writing the book. And then I'll give a brief overview of what covers and end where I end the book, which is on hope. So that's what I'll go through. So I lived on the 21st floor of Grenfell Tower from 2011 to 2014. And many people ask me what it was like living there. Firstly, to my surprise, people seem to be surprised that somebody like me would live in a high-rise building, which I think is interesting in and of itself. So I am South African. I moved to the UK. I have an Irish passport, moved to the UK. Have always just felt coming from Africa, where there's absolutely no social net if you're in trouble, and have always just felt very privileged to live in a country that had things like social housing. But I rented an apartment that was privately owned on the 21st floor of Grenfell because I loved it. It was a beautiful place to live. The two memories that I have, that's a picture of my apartment, and the other picture is a picture of a sunset from Grenfell, which was famous for. It's just these indescribably exquisite views. And the other memory I have of Grenfell is children playing in the lobbies. So I lived, as I said, on the 21st floor. We had 3 families living on our floor, and 7 people on the 21st floor died. And that really is the motivation for the book. So as I professionally, I work in high hazard industries to build the culture and leadership to prevent catastrophes from happening. These 2 images are on the left, what I watched on the 14th of June, and on the right, what I was thinking about. So Piper Alpha, as many people will probably know, is still the biggest industrial disaster in the UK. 167 people died. And I didn't know it at the time, but there's very, very interesting analogies between them. Critically, Piper became more dangerous due to renovations, which moved where the accommodation block where people mustered was and removed a blast wall, etc. And secondly, people in Piper that survived jumped off into the sea, which was against all policy. So you were told if you were jumping into the sea, you would meet certain death, but actually the only people that survived. So there's analogies with the stay put policy and the renovation at Grenfell. But for some reason, because I've obviously worked around disasters, it's not something that I am unused to, is dealing with the pain of disasters, but there's something that really impacted me, which was about people dying in their homes. Because if you die on an oil rig, it's terrible, but you have some choice in terms of putting yourself into that situation. So as I was sitting on the balcony, this image of the orange flames is very vivid for me. You know, it's just like the frightening intensity of the flames. That was probably around 12 hours after the fire began. And I was sitting on my balcony watching it with a journalist who was going to interview me. And I promised I'd do whatever it took to learn. And that was for me in life, one of those existential moments where everything changed in that moment. And I was interviewed for the Today program, said we have to get beyond blame to the systemic and cultural and leadership issues that actually led to decisions being made. Said that 2 days after the fire. And it's probably that was really the seed for the book, because what I'd expected was that you'd get a unified cross-party response, that survivors and bereaved would be well taken care of, that buildings would be made safe, that there'd be bold leadership from government and industry. But rather what we've ended up with is these two distinct worlds. So on the one hand, you have this phenomenal community around North Kensington. You know, there's pictures there of kind of the firefighters who fought so bravely that night. There were errors that the fire brigade made, but that had nothing to do with the people there on the ground that night. And this just beautiful, beautiful community standing for change. And then on the other hand, you have politicians fighting and turning it into a political issue. You have thousands and thousands of buildings unsafe and, in my opinion, failed response to actually make homes safe in the aftermath of Grenfell. And then the final picture is the one that was really shocking to me, which was the burning of the effigy. So it's a Halloween, I think it was Halloween, there was this video made public of a party where people had painstakingly made a model of Grenfell, including putting people at the windows, and burned that. So what I expected was this really great response, because I know that disasters can actually be catalysts for change. And instead, what happened was politics in the worst sense of the world. All of this horrible, racist negativity, and then the failure to make buildings safe. And then on top of that, there's a quote that I have here, which is evidence given by the Fire Brigade Union in 1999 that says the primary risk, therefore, of a cladding system is that of providing a vehicle for assisting uncontrolled fire spread up the outface of the building, with the strong possibility of the fire re-entering the building at higher levels via windows or other unprotected areas in the face of the building. I remember reading that. I remember the day I read that. It was in the morning. I was in my bed and I just burst into tears. I was just like, how could we not have learned? And then you have the picture at the top there is a woman, Catherine, that died in the Lakanal House fire. The recommendations from Lakanal House were not implemented, and many of the same factors at Lakanal played out again at Grenfell. So really, there's this failure to respond in the way that I'd expected to see post a disaster. There's all of these failed opportunities to learn. And then there's the massive scale of the building safety crisis facing the UK. So it wasn't one isolated bad buildings. So I'm not going to read through all the statistics, but you know, there's 455 buildings with the same type of cladding. Only 35% have been completed. There's estimates that it will take between 15 and 50 billion to correct all of the fire safety issues, which include, you know, fire doors, cavity barriers, etc., etc. The government has given 5.1 billion, but based on applications, it seems as if 1 in 4 high-rise buildings are unsafe in the UK. And then we have the situation where people are now unable to mortgage their homes because banks are unwilling to lend unless you've proved that the facades are safe. So you have this incredible situation where you've got people living in unsafe homes, unable to sell them with soaring costs. 23% have reported having thoughts of self-harm or suicide. So really, if I look at the motivation for the book, it's this context. So you have this disaster, my expectation, and I've seen organizations respond well to disasters. The disasters can actually have positive outcomes. And then I've watched this unfold. And then on top of that, as I started writing the book, there was COVID. And I saw all of the same issues that were playing out with Grenfell, playing out with COVID. So I do want to pause for a second and talk about leadership, which is not actually something I write a lot about in the book. But this picture is of Marcio Gomez, who lived on my floor, and his wife, Andrea. And they lost their unborn son, Logan Isaac. He's the youngest victim of Grenfell. And I have been absolutely shocked at, well, firstly, humbled by the grace and dignity and leadership shown by, in the context of Grenfell, the survivors, the community, in the context of COVID, by the frontline workers, by people that have lost their loved ones, and then contrasted sharply with the lack of leadership by those in power. And one thing that troubles me is we almost seem to remove emotion from political decisions. And I really question whether we should be doing that. For me, it is an emotional issue. And the leadership that we see by politicians seems to lack emotion. And I think that actually probably leads to worse decisions. So when I did the book, it started actually as a title. It started looking at what are the lessons from Grenfell. But as I saw, the issue was way broader than Grenfell, that thousands of buildings were unsafe and that we don't learn from any catastrophes. I had to ask the question, why don't we learn from catastrophes in general? Not why don't we learn from Grenfell? So that really is the source of the book. And my intent is to make the water visible, to answer this question, why does our failure to learn make sense? I wanted to spark conversations as opposed to offer the right answer. So in my experience, the right conversations are not happening. So my intent is, in writing the book, is to spark conversation. Essentially, it has two parts. It looks at the fire, at what happened, and then the failures to learn, what we learned about the failures in the actual response, and then the response after Grenfell. And then it looks at, in the second part, it broadens it out and looks at an analysis about why we don't learn more broadly from any disasters. It looks through three lenses, which are my bias. So it looks through the lens of complexity, it looks through the lens of safety, and it looks through the lens of leadership. So those are really the three lenses that I look at. And I talk about what I call systemic change. So one of the things I really had to consider was, well, what do we actually mean by systemic change? We bandy that term around, but what do we mean? And I have distinguished between piecemeal and systemic change. So piecemeal is, you solve a part of the system. It assumes this controllable, predictable world. You fix what's wrong. It requires a technical solution, and your leadership style is bureaucratic, command control, rules based. And we do need piecemeal change. I'm not arguing we don't need piecemeal change. It just doesn't cause systemic change. For systemic change, we need a different way of thinking. We need to approach change from disrupting the status quo, from the notion of experimentation. We need to value the knowledge from all stakeholders. So I look at, in the book, how do we create systemic change? And I do that by looking at these four quadrants. So I've created a model which I call the Grenfell model for systemic change, which looks at governing frameworks and operating frameworks, the foundational elements that we have in place, like regs, the behavioral elements, what do we do to prevent and respond, which I call the obvious ones, which is what we mostly focus on, is let's change regulation, and let's change the regulations or inquests or inquiries. But actually there's these obscure elements, which is all about the relational aspects and the contextual aspects, that actually, if we don't get to those, we won't stand a chance of systemic change. And in each of those, I look at why we don't learn and how we might enable systemic change. Looking at what are the myths, what are the known issues, what specific lessons are they from Grenfell, and then concluding with two questions. What are the conditions that are holding the status quo in place, and what might be opportunities to disrupt? This is a slide. I'm just going to leave it up there and let people look at it, but it shows what are the issues that we know about in each of these things. So for example, regulatory vulnerabilities, issues with regulation, groupthink, speaking truth to power. These are all known issues. There's nothing surprising here. But when I researched it, this is, I think, when we look at why we don't learn, this is making the water visible and the types of issues that just keep the status quo in place and stop any transformational or systemic change happening. Just as a summary, what I say is the key myths that we would need to debunk are that regulations guarantee safe outcomes, that there is a perfect error-free world, and then suddenly somebody makes a mistake, and if we just remove them, everything will be great, that the softer relational issues aren't that important, and finally, that you can create systemic change without shifting context or looking at our deeply held assumptions and beliefs. And then what I think are the conditions that hold the status quo in place, which I argue actually we shouldn't even bother about working on. We should take those as givens because there's so no desire to change any of these things that we should just go, okay, these are the conditions that are holding it in place and just work on other ways of disruption. But there's a failure to deal with known issues in governance and accountability that have been around. I mean, I've been shocked in my research. You just see report after report after report from think tank, academic institution, raising the same issues over and over again, and nothing changes. The obsession with blame and blame avoidance. So that absolutely, blame and learning are very not good bedfellows, but we are obsessed with blame and blame avoidance, particularly in the political domain. And then there's a failure to rebalance power. So, you know, one of the critical things is the power of voices. So we see it all over in Grenfell, residents raising concerns, in the COVID front line raising concerns, but those voices don't get heard. And a voice without power means no change. So there's a failure to rebalance power. And if I look at it, really fundamentally, there's a lack of political intent and will for change, because we know the issues. And that's not a party political statement across all parties. We know the issues and we don't change things. And then what I would say is opportunities for disruption is developing our capability to deal with complexity and ambiguity, to move away from a kind of bureaucratic control, command, predictable world mindset. I think the more that we could engage with that, the better it would be. To ensure fairly borne consequences. So in the case of Grenfell, we're seeing who's paying the consequences as innocent leaseholders, not the people that actually built unsafe building or created unclear regulations. Critically tapping diverse and distributed knowledge. So I think we need to challenge the notion of expertise. And then finally, creating safe spaces to explore deeply held views is what I would say are the opportunities to disrupt. And then I will end on hope. So it was very important to me when I was writing the book, as much as I have gone through very dark days of no hope, but it didn't feel right to me to end the book without hope. And where I have found hope is in what I call the democratization of change. So I do believe with the Internet of Things, with how connected the world is, that citizens have the opportunity to create change. And again, in the UK context, you see that with the cladding scandal, where you've got communities who are impacted from across the country getting together and campaigning through united voices. And I do believe that that's really, we shouldn't rely on government, but that there is hope in the democratization of change. And we all probably have a duty to cause that. So I will end there and stop sharing.
Thank you very much, Gill. That was really interesting and a great summary of what's in the book. Obviously, there's a lot more in terms of detail. Yes. But one issue that jumps out from particularly the slide before last for me is an underlying issue, which is about transparency, particularly transparency in government, but also in the private sector. both around Grenfell and around the COVID pandemic. One of the issues that I've been really concerned about is just the lack of transparency. I mean, on COVID, the Department of Health and Public Health England were just, they had to be forced to reveal who was on the scientific advisory group, the names of the people, just at that level. And at the moment, it's still going on. At the moment, the English government, or the Westminster government, refuses to publish any information about vaccine supplies, whereas the Scottish government has. And that's clearly a crucial issue in terms of the whole of the system, thinking about how we're going to deliver this stuff when it comes along. And yet they're refusing to release the information. And it's been like that all the way through for the last 15 months. And I just wondered, you didn't mention transparency and openness specifically, but it seemed to underlie a lot of those points.
So I do think that there's a big issue, and where it plays out is actually within trust. So there's also, do you know Honora O'Neill's stuff on, she did the Reith lectures on trust a number of years ago. So I found her quite interesting. Oh wow, but I found it's super interesting when she talks about the issues, not so much transparency, it's about deception. Right. So now maybe I do think there's something around either if you're hiding things, so if you're not releasing data, that is an issue of transparency. And I do agree, I think in the case of COVID, there is that. In the case of buildings with residents, sometimes residents are not even given a fire risk assessment. It's like their home. You won't give them a fire risk assessment. Like, that's just absolutely insane. And it intrigues me, Colin, about what must the mindset be that makes that action make sense to people. So, but I think where it plays out systemically is it leads to diminishing trust. And then you get that played out with governments, just the different behaviors and, comings and whatever. So you get these insane things. I do, however, think that there's a role for think tanks or other institutions to play, because I think part of the issue is where the data is available, it's not that accessible. So in fact, on the building safety crisis, there's quite a lot of data, but for me to sort through that, as I work, I have a very busy job. So I think there's both an issue of transparency, but there's also an issue of making data accessible and given in a way that we can make meaning out of it. I think the government's very, very good at making data making data available, but not accessible.
Yeah.
Which is the same point of deception, so yeah. That's my rambling mind on that one.
I would agree with that. And your point about think tanks, and the biggest think tanks we've got are universities, actually, and making this stuff available to, and trying to get university to engage with, is incredibly important. I mean, I've been digging into the history of contingency planning for what's called civil contingencies in the UK, emergency planning, basically. And one of the things I was struck by was, for example, we had a planning exercise, what's the right word for it? A simulation exercise of a flu pandemic 5 years ago called Cygnus. Yes. Which included over 1,000 people from different parts of the public sector and some private sector organisations who were likely to be involved over 3 days. Massive exercise. The report's never been published, it's only been leaked. That's how I got hold of a copy. Eventually, I think it's been put on the government website after it had been leaked and everybody had seen it, but not until after the pandemic had actually started. And there were loads of lessons in there. It was, in my view, a very badly written report. As you say, the information was available, but it wasn't very easy to access, in the sense of, you had to really wade through it to find stuff. But it just struck me as amazing that hadn't been made public, that there'd been no debate about it, that, and it could have helped to inform and avoid some of the problems and mistakes that we've made during the pandemic.
I think, you know, Colin, it's a similar thing with the other thing that just completely baffled me is there's no process to ensure that the inquiry or inquest recommendations are implemented or affected or effective. Right. And I'm like, so the analogy for me is, you know, oil and gas company has an accident and then they do research, they come up with all of these recommendations and then they don't track whether they're closed off. Yeah. And you're not looking at holistically what are the issues, because there are issues that run across all of them, whether it's failure to listen to those at the front line, failure to learn lessons from the past, whatever it is. So I don't understand why we don't do it, because it's not that we don't know the lessons, it's that we refuse to learn the lessons.
Yeah. It has been done once in British government after the Soham situation where a guy killed 2 young women and young girls and should have been stopped by social services and others before that happened. There was an inquiry run by Mike Bechard, now Lord Bechard. And what Mike did, what I thought was really interesting, was that at the end of the inquiry, he didn't close the inquiry. Yes. He said, this is our interim report. We're going to come back in a year's time and ask all the government departments and others involved what they've done to implement our recommendations. And it's the only time I've ever seen in Whitehall where suddenly there were these SERM inquiry implementation units set up in the Home Office and Department of Health and various other places. And they scrambled around trying to make sure that in a year's time they had a decent story to tell you know, and I thought that was such a good example, but it's never been repeated. You know, we continue to do these inquiries and investigations which come up with a set of recommendations and then they shut down, and that's the end of it. And there's no attempt to actually follow that through, as you said, by, you know, coming back a year later or 2 years later and saying, well, what did you do in response to this?
And I do, you know, one thought, I think I read it somewhere and I can't remember where, but imagine if you got the departments that would be accountable involved in writing the recommendations, because I don't think it's as easy or as simple as going, well, they should all implement, because it's complex, right? So why are we not going, well, these are the key findings, and then doing the recommendations collaboratively? Because also, you know, if somebody tells you what to do and you haven't been involved in the decision, you have less ownership of, you know, implementing it. So I think there's one, you know, why don't you just do it? But sometimes the recommendations also might be problematic. So I think there's much more creative ways that we could go around actually writing the recommendations and then assessing their effectiveness over time.
Yeah, I think there's some interesting lessons from the private sector there. I mean, the fashion in the 70s, 80s, 90s was, if you had a problem in a big private sector organisation, you brought the consultants in, they sort of went around and looked at the problem, came up with a big report, loads of recommendations, which was then handed back to the organisation and then went onto the shelves and gathered dust, basically. Yes. And there was no engagement and there was no interaction between the consultants and the organisation to actually change things. And I think that's fallen out of fashion these days, to some extent anyway, in the private sector. And there's more attempt to actually do things by, you know, trial and error, trying things out, seeing what works, and using some external challenge as a way of thinking better about problems.
Exactly. But it's which, you know, it goes back to my whole thing about blame and blame avoidance, because if that's your primary concern, then you're never going to openly be able to engage in a conversation about what your vulnerabilities are, what you've done wrong, what you could learn better, how you could experiment. So I do think that's a key kind of underpinning. And you know, and it drives a super adversarial way of governing, which for me at least, because I spend my work in learning environments, and then I look at government and I'm going, well, there's no hope, because there's no safe space to explore what you did wrong, because you'll just get beaten down, you know.
Yeah, no, I think that's a perennial problem with all sorts of policy areas. Anyway, it's been absolutely fascinating. I strongly recommend people read the book, but I do warn people as a health warning, the first 2 chapters are pretty harrowing. I found them quite hard to read, I have to say, just because of what you're describing happened. But I would urge people to get it. And thanks very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much, Colin, for the invitation.
That's great. Thank you.